Hello everyone, we are back yet again, and today we're going to be talking, I guess it's tonight, well it's tonight here, tonight we're going to be talking about ambient occlusion maps and what are they and why are they and how do we make one. We talked about ID maps this afternoon, and the ambient occlusion map kind of falls into the same category. Used to be something we used for a totally different purpose. So they've stuck around and we found new purposes for them. So we'll get on with that. As part of this, the afternoon one didn't take nearly as long as I thought it was going to. So what I'm going to be doing is modeling a little box object, and then that way I figured I can kind of point out how ambient occlusion maps work a little bit better as I model it, and then I'll bake it when I'm done. So just so you know. And we're looking at Quixel here. So let's talk about ambient occlusion maps, or AO maps as they are known to their friends. The ambient occlusion map, kind of similar story to the ID map. They have been around for a really long time, but we used to use them for totally different purposes than we do today. I remember first running into ambient occlusion maps in plugins for 3D software about, probably 20 years ago at this point. And they would use ambient occlusion maps, or at least the calculations that become ambient occlusion maps, in really old plugins like Dirty Rays for Lightwave, or Dirt Maker plugins, where the program would calculate where light can hit, or where light can reach, and then it would apply it to like a dirt mask or a channel mask so that your model looked dirtier, or it would accentuate the details. That's why we liked them. And that's actually what AO maps were used for quite a long time, is a way to make the details of your model stand out. Up until about 5, 6, 7 years ago, we would use AO maps, bake them out from your favorite 3D program, and then overlay them on our diffuse maps to basically frame the details. So your objects inside the game would be more recognizable. You'd see the edges, because it's usually around the edges, or the intersecting of where polygons meet, edges, indented details, where you get that ambient occlusion dark and light contrast, and it makes the objects a little bit more easier to pick out the details on. So what I've got here is a Arcana model. We saw this in the ID map video, and it's got an AO map on it. Now in Quixel, I don't have it baking out an ambient occlusion map. It's not normal to bake out an ambient occlusion map, but an ambient occlusion map is one of the maps that you really need to input when you start your model in Quixel, and that's because it frames that detail. If I take a look at the my AO map, now this was baked in Blender, and you could see that there's a lot of light areas and a lot of dark areas, a lot of contrast. The dark areas are all the areas that the light can't reach. Now they're not shadows. An ambient occlusion map doesn't take into account self-shadowing or cast shadows. That's a shadow map. And shadow maps aren't that useful, because the shadows can be anywhere on the object. But an AO map is going to find anywhere that light can't reach. So this area here is probably on the inside of my little walled wooden area. These pitch dark areas are probably on the bottom of the model, and these really light areas are probably on the top of the model. So you can see all the information you start to get from these maps. A program like Quixel or Substance Painter can now tell a lot about your model just from the AO map. It can tell where there's surface breaks, where those polygons change direction. It can tell where polygons are intersecting other polygons, that kind of fuzzy shadow there. If I pop this up, that's this area right here. It can tell what areas are on the bottom, what areas are on the top. It can tell where there's chamfered or angled areas. So it can also tell where there's a lot of detail packed together because light can't reach those areas. So an AO map's more than just a shadow map. Shadow map wouldn't really do us much good, but the AO map can tell another program a whole lot about your model. Now, the reason we load these into Quixel, Substance Painter, whatever it might be, is so that it can generate other maps, like edge maps, normal maps. It can guess what your model really looks like just from, well, in part, from the AO map. So they're very helpful. You can also see why we like to overlay them on diffuse textures back in the day, because we can really accentuate things like these lines in the wood here, or the dark areas on the interior. Now, today's models are not self-lit, but are lit inside the game engine much, much better than they used to be. So I wouldn't recommend using an AO map to burn down into your diffuse map anymore. Your real-time lighting in your game engine is probably going to do that for you, but it's a good trick in case you're doing something like a sprite game or something like that if you don't have real-time lighting. Alright, so now that we've taken a look at the old AO map, let's hop over here to Blender and let's deal with making a model that should have a fairly clear AO map on it. So what I'm going to do is just start with a box in this case. And my box, we're going to make a little bit bigger so it's a little easier to work on. And all I'm going to do on this is I'm just going to work on one side. And I'm going to create a situation that should catch some light and make a fairly distinct AO map. Now, I'm going to try and get some contrast on this. So we're going to have some areas that kind of indent in, some thin areas, some thicker areas, some wider areas, a couple things going on here. So actually, let's go to the top polygon here. That way I can just use the Z-axis. So I'm going to extrude this polygon, and we're going to scale it down a little bit. And we're going to grab this polygon and just move him up a little bit. I think that will work. And we're going to come in here. I'm going to add some polygons there, and we're going to smooth those out. We'll see if we can get kind of a fuzzy surface there on the side with that. I'm going to add a few more polygons just to see what that does. Let's go ahead and go back and select this middle polygon, and we're going to extrude this and scale it in. And then I'm going to do a couple extrudes here. We'll go downward, scale this. I'm going to make this a real tight extrusion there. Okay, and we're going to come back in here, and this time I'm going to go the other way with this. There we go. I'm going to zoom in there so you can kind of see what I'm doing. So we've got this really deep area here that should trap a lot of light. In other words, it should be black down in there once we get to baking this. Let's extrude another area here. We'll scale this one in and kind of make another little platform here. And this one I'm going to just move upward, I think. And we're going to do the same thing here with this edge, except we're going to smooth this the other way. I'm going to put in a lot of polygons just so I get a smooth render on that. Okay. And we'll get a hold of this last piece here. And let's make another area that should trap our light pretty well. So we'll scale this in. Let's see, actually I want to make that go straight down. Now we'll scale it a teensy bit. Alright, let's do an extrusion again and scale that. I'm going the wrong way, going the wrong way, going the wrong way. There we go. Wait. Oh, I had it. There we go. Okay. And we'll do another extrusion on that. Scale it in a little bit. And we'll just move that upward, I think. Okay. So what we've got there is a structure that should, we shall see, it should give us a decent ambient occlusion map. It should kind of look like this structure when we're done, in contrast. So, well, let's see what we get. How are we doing on time? Yeah, we're all right. So let's go ahead and map this guy. So we'll go to select all. And we'll map it. Now I'm not going to map this particularly carefully, or very carefully. So our map is probably going to be pretty messy looking. I'm not going to go in there and seam this all together. Yeah, you can see it's kind of got parts scattered all over the place there, but it should work. Let me go ahead and we'll pack these just in case we've got any that are overlapping, because that'll give us some weird results. So we'll just pack those islands. Okay. So those should be now all separated. Ideally, when we pack these, we want some sort of margin on these. I'm going to give it a margin of 16. That's overkill, but at least then we'll be able to see it. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with some black lines over here. We won't be able to tell all the separate pieces. All right. So you can see nothing special in the UV mapping except that you don't want overlapping areas unless they're going to be exactly the same. You're probably better off not overlapping them, and that just kind of goes for most of your UV maps at this point. And you could start overlapping it once you're sure that nothing would change in your different map types. Alright, with that in mind, so let's get to Bacon now. I didn't even need to close that down actually. Let's open that back up. We can open up our UV editor. Need to do a couple things to get ready to bake this. So first I'm going to go make a material. I'm going to hit new. It can just be this white material, that's fine. I need to come over here to my UV image editor and hit new, and this is going to be my AO map, so I'll just name it. You don't have to. You set your size right there. I don't want an alpha channel only because Quixel doesn't really deal with alpha channels particularly well. So I'm going to say OK. It should turn black, and for some reason it scales up like that. Now if you've already got a map in here, like now I've made this map, you can hit that little plus button. So if you've been working on your model, you might have a diffuse map, a normal map, something. You just hit that little plus button and you do all the same process. Blender's interface changes once there's a map in here, but you just hit the little plus button. Alright, and so we're ready to go bake. If we go over to our little camera, we're going to go down to bake. Now I should mention, if you've got more than one model, or you're baking from a high to low, that's usually why you would have more than one model, you would go out to your object mode, click on both models, hold down shift, click on the low poly last, and then enter edit mode. Now with AO maps, you don't necessarily need a high low poly bake. They don't really work the same as normals, but just reminding you that in case that's what you're doing here, because you could bake your AO map and your normal map out all at the same time. Alright, so with this guy selected, everything over here selected, everything over here selected, go over to your bake, and it is at the bottom here of your render tab. And we want, instead of full renders, we want ambient occlusion right there. You can you can hit selected to active. We don't really need to in this case, but I'm just used to clicking on it. Clear should be clicked on so that it overwrites the old map in case we need to re-render this somehow. You can see there's some other settings here. I don't usually deal with these settings too much. The distance and the bias, sometimes I do. We'll see what we get here. Because we've got some tight little areas, I wouldn't be surprised if we have to finagle with these numbers here, but we'll see. So we're ready to go. And before we hit bake, remember you're going to watch up here for that little progress bar. That's really the only way we know that it's working. Ambient occlusion maps can take a while, quite a long time. I don't think they will in this box, so we'll see. So we'll hit bake. There's our little progress bar. Yeah, that's real quick. And you can see it's all done at this point. So let's see what we got. And let's go back out to object mode. And you can see not a particularly good ambient occlusion bake there. We didn't really get much in that. So let's go back over here and finagle with our settings. Like I said, we might have to. So what I'm going to do is we're going to hit normalize. Let's see if that does anything for us. We'll hit bake, and I don't think it did. Nope, not much. Oh, I should mention that the ambient occlusion maps in Blender are not very contrasty. They are if you use cycles, and we're not using cycles right now, obviously, but they're not going to stand out. I usually have to take them over to Photoshop and brighten them up. Okay, so let's go in here and play with the distance and the bias. I'm just going to bump the bias up a little bit and see if that does anything. And we'll hit bake, and that might be a little bit better. Let's see. Not much in there. Let's go back, select everything, and see if we can get the bias a little bit higher. Turn that off. Until it's calculating. This time we got some difference going. And yeah, see, now we're starting to get that ambient occlusion map that we would expect. So see the dark and the light areas. Now that's what I mean, the finagling with this over here seems to be the thing. I don't know if it's that selected to active. Let me see if that's the difference. Yeah, okay. Selected to active off in this case seems to be working better. Let me bump the bias back down. I don't think that's actually doing anything. And let's hit bake again. We should get a decent, yeah, there we go. That's a little better. So what we want are those lights and darks. And so what we're looking at over here, those darker areas are going to be these probably inner walls or these little caverns down here. And the lighter areas are all the polygons that are facing outward. Now that's most of the polygons, so we'd expect it to be that way. A few things about Blender's ambient occlusion. They get pretty grainy, and that hasn't really hurt the results I get over in Quixel. But I do usually take these into Photoshop and bump the contrast up on them because I'd really like for this to be white and these to be almost black. It's not a very big range that it uses when it calculates them, so you might want to, it won't hurt it to take it into Photoshop. You could also paint in features in ambient occlusion maps. So For instance, if I had a big medallion or something on this side, and you just wanted to paint that in, you certainly could if that medallion was, say, a separate object, or maybe you didn't want to bake that piece in yet. You can always paint those structures in. So, oh, and at this point we would go to image, and we'd have to save our image because it's not automatically going to be saved by Blender. By the way, that little asterisk right there means that there's a new image that has been created and is not saved. I missed that for about the first 2 years I was using Blender. I didn't know that, but that's what that little asterisk right there. It's Blender's very subtle way of telling you that you need to save your maps. So that's the ambient occlusion map, at least out of Blender. Okay, so I'm going to hop back over now to Quixel, so we can take a little bit better look at this map. I'm going to close preview there. Now this map's been cleaned up a little bit. Like I said, the default renderer in Blender really doesn't do a very good job of rendering ambient occlusion maps. It does a pretty good job of rendering normal maps. It's not AO maps. I'm not sure why. And there is a way to do it through cycles. I've never tried it, so I haven't really found the need, because I can always just bring the map over into Photoshop and clean it up a little bit. But that said, I'm also used to other programs giving me a better ambient occlusion map. Now, the other way you can go, if you're using Blender and you really don't like that AO map, which I wouldn't blame you, you can use XNormal. And there's two ways to bake out your map in XNormal. I'm going to start XNormal here. I'm not going to bake one, but I'll point you to the two ways. You can load a high and a low into XNormal, and then bake out your ambient occlusion map that way. That's probably your best bet, if you have a high poly model. Or you can, so we can load a high and a low poly. You go to baking options if that's the case, and there's your ambient occlusion map. And you can see there's your settings for ambient occlusion map. You can look up these settings. There's a lot of different ways you can bake your AO map. I usually just kind of use a couple formulas that seem to work for me. Or you can just go down here to Tools, and they have this simple ambient occlusion map baker. And this one you just load a model, one model, usually it would be a low poly in this case, and then you could just bake out your map. This isn't as exact as baking it from a high poly, but it works pretty good. Also, if you're going to go this route, you might want to use this ray distance calculator and let it run for like 20 seconds. So you load your model in here, you hit go, it just runs forever, but let it run for about 20-30 seconds, and then close it, and then go run this. I don't exactly know what that's doing, but you get better results. It's somehow calculating better results. It's like the Better Eyes feature in XNormal. You can use that for normal maps too. So, but if you don't like the maps that Blender is going to give you, you can go that route. Now, if you're using Max or Maya, you can certainly look up real quickly how to bake them. I think Max does a really good job with ambient occlusion and normal maps. Maya does all right. And Dale is providing us with tonight's entertainment. So that's going to wrap up the ambient occlusion maps. There isn't as much to the ID maps and ambient occlusion maps as I originally had planned there to be. I had planned these to be little bit longer talks, and by the time I got the videos prepped, there isn't much to them. You can kind of just go shoot through them and get done with that. But if you're going to be using Quixel or any of the PBR programs that are out right now, you're going to need to get used to baking out ambient occlusion maps, normal maps. Now the normal maps are the bigger issue. They take a little bit more thought. And ID maps. Those three maps are the ones that will do you the most good importing into Quixel. Because with version 2.0, Quixel will bake all the other maps for you, but it won't bake those. And it needs something to give it some information on the model. Remember, Quixel isn't unwrapping anything. It's just using maps to generate information. So you got to do all your unwrapping and baking in other programs. Alright, well that's going to do it for tonight. So I will see everyone tomorrow. Let me tell you real quick what we're going to be doing tomorrow. Tomorrow we have, for your enjoyment, at 10 a.m. we've got plugins in Max that I think are nifty. So that's another Max video. These will be free or very inexpensive plugins that I just think are wonderful. And then we're going to be talking at 12 noon Pacific time. We're going to be talking about loading models and maps into Dedo and getting Dedo happy with the maps that you put into it. So that is tomorrow. I will see everybody then. Have a good night. Bye-bye.